based on, my education and my professional experience. They brought me to medical, and basically the medical director and the consulting physician for the facility basically told me that they brought me up as a professional courtesy, which meant to me if I was anyone else, they wouldn't even be paying me any attention. And they wanted to let me know, because they were both women of color, that they could do nothing for me. And the way that they said it was, this facility was built for men. We didn't expect to have women. We definitely didn't expect to have a pregnant woman. And there is nothing that we can do for you.
Welcome to the Prison Cells podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Robert Craig, and we have a really special episode, so I'm excited to talk to everybody today. With us, as usual, is Tank Johnson. Tank, how you doing today?
All good. Good to be here.
Great to talk to you again. And John Dacey with Abolish Private Prisons. How are you doing, John?
Great, thanks. And thanks, Pamela, for joining us today.
Absolutely. And we have two guests with us today. The first is Pamela Winn, and we are going to get into her background and all the amazing stuff she's doing. Pam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for joining us. As John said, also with us is an summer intern with Abolish Private Prisons, Ali Hakala. Ali, how are you doing today? Thanks for making the time. All right, so we're going to get right into Pamela's story, because the two things I want to talk about today are the experiences that you had, Pamela, and then also what you've been able to accomplish. I know it's a long list, and I hope we're going to have time to talk about all of it because it's some really incredible work. So let's just jump right in. And can you tell us, about you, who you are, and sort of how you got involved in the space that we're talking about?
Sure. So my name is Pamela Winn. I am a native Atlantan. Um, and basically, my story started as just that, being from a typical Southern black family, which means that my family was uneducated and low income. I aspired as a kid to change the generational dynamics of my family, which means that I was a first generation high school graduate, college graduate, and entrepreneur. And in being an entrepreneur, because I did not have any experience or anyone from my environment having any type of business experience, when I came upon challenges with my business, I just kind of figured things out on my own, which led me to making some poor business decisions. And I was criminalized for those decisions and served a 78-month federal sentence. During the time that I was incarcerated, I was pregnant and shackled, which caused me to fall, miscarry my baby, and then placed in solitary confinement. And that basically, and then coming home, having my nursing license revoked. In addition to being an entrepreneur, I was also a registered nurse that specialized in women's health for about 15 years, and having my license revoked when I came home, and being in, having new career choices, as well as the experiences that had happened to me during my incarceration, motivated me to start my organization, RestoreHER US.America, where we advocate for formerly incarcerated and incarcerated women with a focus around pregnant women. We address the social determinants of criminalization and social inequities concerning these women, and work with them to enhance their lives and end mass incarceration and prison birth of women of color in the South.
Yeah. I mean, there is so much to dive in there. That was like a really incredible overview. And there's like 18 topics that I hope we can get into all tucked in there. So let's start sort of in the middle, I guess. And your ability to sort of gloss over the trauma that you experienced in prison, I imagine only comes from the repeated telling of that story. Because you talked about at least three pretty traumatic things, like pretty quickly. So to the extent that you want to and are able, if you can sort of explore each of those and go into the detail that you're comfortable with, you know, just the fact that when you were in a prison and you're pregnant, what is the actual physical shackling like? Because I think we have some idea in our minds from what we see on TV or something
Right.
like that, but I think the sort of visceral experience is different.
Sure. So you're exactly right, Robert. I tell my story, I'm sure over 100 times, all over the country, also internationally. So yes, it's and although I've told it hundreds of times, and although it happened in 2008, it's still just as fresh each time I talk about it. So yes, I have learned to just kind of sail through it, in order to do the things that I need to do in my work. But if we want to get in depth with it, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that because it's important for me to educate folks to know what's going on and to, bring some humanization to these women to address these issues that we have a problem with. So, shackling, most people don't know what shackling is. So, what shackling looks like is you have a chain that's double wrapped around your belly. Then that chain is connected to your wrist cuffs with a black box about the size of a cassette tape. And it clamps onto those wrist cuffs and clamps onto those chains double wrapped around your belly to hold them in place. So you're stuck in a position with your hands directly in front of you, and there's no movement beyond that. And then you have also ankle cuffs, cuffs around your ankles that are connected to a chain between your legs. So your movement is very limited, which is the challenge for a woman who is pregnant. Well, it's a challenge for anyone, honestly, because the way cuffs are designed, the more you move, the tighter they get. And so if you're trying to walk, which I was, with these ankle cuffs on, with each step, they're getting tighter. And this particular day, by the time I made it to the van, they were literally biting into my ankles. I could feel where the skin had broken and trying to step up and make that step in the air. I just was unable and I misstepped and I fell. Falling while you're shackled is equivalent to a tree falling. It's just a very hard fall, straight slap down on the ground because you are, like I said, stuck in a position where you cannot brace your fall, you cannot do anything to help yourself. It's a very hard fall. And when I fell that day, there was nobody even asked me, was I okay? Two officers just kind of grabbed me from each side and scooped me up, stuck me on the van, and off we went. And that whole day, I kept thinking to myself, well, surely, they know that I'm pregnant. Somebody's going to check me. Somebody's going to at least ask me I'm okay or something. None of that happened. And I spent more than 2 weeks. So shortly after that, like the next day, I started having spotting, then streaking, then bleeding, and I spent more than 2 weeks writing to medical, asking for some type of, remedy, some type of treatment, and it just basically went upon deaf ears till about maybe that 2.5 weeks. I finally got a response back, and what the response said was, "This is normal with pregnancy." And when I got that response back, I replied back, explaining my credentials to them and my professional, experience, and that it was not, part of pregnancy.
Yeah. Tank, did you ever, when you're lifting weights, have you ever used like chains, when you're like squatting or bench pressing to add weight to the bar?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's like such an interesting dynamic because one of the things that you do that for is because as you move it gets harder, right? Like it adds this dynamic effect to the workout that throughout your range of motion it gets harder, which is sort of the opposite from how the normal bench press and squat works just because of biomechanics.
Right.
But to think that they're using that same effect, right, that you felt before, to like the way that you move and your momentum is like added to by the chains, and doing that to anybody, but specifically pregnant women, it really is like amazing the amount that the weight and the way that it's distributed affects your ability to do what is otherwise normal movements.
Yeah, I think you said a key word there is the weight distribution. As the weights elongate, what ends up happening is it's almost like you don't know where your center of gravity is, just because you're not used to the added weight on different sides of your body, and so there's almost a downward pull where you're trying to stand upright, but because of the change, it's actually pulling your center of gravity down, just making it very awkward to walk. So yes, I completely understand that. Yeah, it's tough.
And for obvious reasons, I've never been pregnant, but uh, my partner has. I have a son, and I have several younger siblings, so I've been very close to people who have been pregnant. And one thing that happens is your center of gravity is constantly changing, right? Like as your pregnancy develops, it just changes dramatically on like a day-to-day basis. And along with that, you have these physiological changes that are happening throughout, your bone structure and your pelvic structure and all that stuff. So to those two things strike me as something that are both dramatic, and they work in tandem to make these kinds of falls, I suspect, more likely. Do you know if it's like a common I haven't it's not something that I've heard about as being, a common issue, but I suspect that it likely is.
It is, and as I described the way that I was shackled, they also shackle some women. Instead of having, if they don't have the black box available, they have another set of chains that go from the wrist cuff down to the ankle cuffs. So we have one young lady that speaks about, she's about 6 feet tall and having to walk hunched over and pregnant with twins because these chains are only so long and they're connected to her ankles. And she's having to, you know, move around like that, back and forth to court, back and forth to medical visits and all that type of thing.
I mean, that's literally the opposite of how your body is not like, you know, there's this natural tendency to lean backwards, right? Because
Yeah.
your center of gravity is shifting forward. So if you're forced to being hunched, I can only imagine like how awkward that must be to walk.
Yeah, Pamela, I was so when I was looking at some of the articles that came when I was doing my wonderful research on you. You know, it talked about not having the proper facilities and things of that nature to assist pregnant women. And in your studies and in your travels, is the percentage of women entering facilities that are pregnant, is it that small to where they don't need to have those resources? What percentage? What are the percentages like?
So I'm glad you asked that question because that also brings up a topic that is very essential, one that I fight about on a regular basis, that is always included in the legislation and always cut out by the Sheriff's Association, and that is the data collection. So honestly speaking, I cannot honestly tell you how many women we're talking about. And the reason that I say that is because the statistics that you find when you Google and when you look at articles are based on data that is provided by federal facilities and a lot of state facilities. And even with those facilities reporting their data is not always accurate. For example, our state facility here in Georgia called Helms is where all of the state women that are pregnant in custody are held. On their website, they reported that they had a man pregnant, and that man was pregnant for more than a year on that website. So even if a man miraculously was impregnated, he would definitely have that baby before a year. So that's what we're looking at when we're looking at data. And then on top of that, we're talking about county facilities, local jails, detention centers, all these types of places that don't or and are not mandated to report any data. And this is where most of the women are, because a lot of them are arrested. They may bond out, they may lose their babies before they're sentenced and sent to a state or a federal facility, like I did. So we just don't have the data. And the other problem is there's no standardization of care across the country for these. Every facility operates independently how they choose to. So that's another big issue with obtaining data and accurate data. And even in the legislation that I have passed, we always include data collection. We want to know how many women are in your facility, how many of those women are pregnant, how many, have live births and all of that. And every single time the sheriffs fight us and remove that data. And the reason is they don't want to be held accountable or liable for what happens with these women under their watch.
At APP, we believe the only way to truly end for-profit prisons in the United States is to challenge the constitutionality of private for-profit prisons in the courts. And with your help and moral courage, we will succeed. Completely donor-funded, we ask for your support. Your tax-deductible contribution will provide vital funding for building the infrastructure necessary to win a fight of this scale. And every dollar will bring us one step closer to our goal of abolishing private prisons. Please join the fight today by visiting abolishprivateprisons.org and click the donate button at the top of the site. And of course, like, share, and subscribe to the Prison Cells podcast from wherever you listen. Now back to the discussion.
This is, we're lucky to have Allie on the call with us because one of the areas that Allie is specialized and has some expertise in is in data collection. Before going to law school, she did some very in-depth research. So I think these are issues that Allie is helping us work through. One of the things that we are constantly fighting with is the private facilities aren't required. A lot of the data that you're talking about theoretically should be available under some kind of FOIA, Freedom of Information request, or the state level equivalent,
and
Sunshine
we send
Record.
those, and we get blatant responses back that say we don't collect this data.
Totally. So there's these multiple layers of people that are intentionally obfuscating the data for the purposes you're talking about. And then there's, I think sometimes it's just hard to collect data on these populations that are moving, frequently back and forth. And then
I
makes it
wish
hard
I
to
could
record.
agree with you on that. And
Really?
the reason that I cannot is because, as I raise in every committee hearing, when the sheriff, makes the comment about how difficult it is for them to collect this data, the fact is they count at least 4 times a day. So if you're counting at least 4 times a day, and they have to count because that's the only way that they can know the number of folks in that facility for, financial reasons, to feed these people, clothing, all of the things, all of their
Safety,
inventory.
escape, yeah.
And also to know if anybody has escaped, which is the main reason that they count.
Yeah.
So my question is always to them, if you count several times a day, why is it hard to at least tell us how many, when you're counting, how many women that you have in that facility?
Yeah, no.
We could, that would be a good start, because
Yeah,
at least then we can have a true count of the
No,
number.
it seems right. The only thing that came to mind, and it seems like what that would at least require is sort of generating a report every day, which now that I'm saying it out loud is not a big burden. So maybe it's not as hard as I was thinking.
And they do, because
Yeah.
again, they have to show that no one has escaped. Everyone is there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it reminds me a little bit of the NFL and kind of what they did with concussions, right? And so we'd be playing in the games, and there's several guys who are getting hit and getting concussed, but they would only deem it a concussion if you did not return back into the game. You just kind of had your bell rung, and so it skews the data in favor of the NFL and the owner saying oh no, we're taking care of all of our players and all of that. And so, it kind of reminds me of that same kind of like, make the data work for what you want it to say type of thing.
Right. Because I'm sure when it's time for them to get funding, they know exactly how many women they have in that facility.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, no. For real, that's real talk.
And then so you have those two layers, and then also this layer that there's no legal requirement for private prisons, any private facilities, to give that data in even through a FOIA request, right? Like even working through these legal channels, they are exempted from some of these record request laws.
Correct. They're exempted from a lot of things because they are private, and that's a big issue. There is an organization, NCCHC, which is an organization that they're like a credibility organization that prisons can partner with to say, and what they do is they provide best practices and policies for how to maintain folks that are incarcerated in these facilities. It's kind of like with hospitals where they have joint accreditation, which says that we are following these policies, these best practices when we're taking care of people. Same thing. However, nobody is required to have this accreditation. It just looks good if you do, but you're not required to have it. So therefore, if you're not required and you don't have to spend the money to have this certification, and you don't have to be bothered with being accountable to the best practices that NCCHC says that you should have, then they don't. Again, it's a free for all. Everybody's free to do and operate how they choose.
Is that accreditation organization specific to healthcare?
Yes.
Okay,
For
John.
carceral healthcare.
Right. John, can you talk a little bit about the private prison accreditation group? Because I think I wonder if there's a similar issue here about the way that it's captured.
There is the American Correctional Association, and they accredited, obviously, corrections facilities. How effective they are and whether they're a captured entity is a separate conversation. I know that Senator Elizabeth, I'm blanking on her name, from Massachusetts.
Warren.
Senator Warren's office issued a report on the ACA perhaps a year and a half ago that described ACA as a captured entity by the private prison industry and basically challenged their credibility.
And just real quickly, in case people aren't familiar with that term captured, what did the report from Elizabeth Warren show, or at least allege?
You're taxing my memory. I don't remember the specifics. I know some of the things I've seen about the industry is the underwriting of travel and accommodation costs for national meetings of corrections directors, as an example. That's different than the ACA. But it tells you where the industry is throwing around its influence.
So in general, if you have these accrediting organizations, one of the things that can happen is you get people from inside the industry that's supposed to be regulated that move to the accreditation agency, and they have this weird conflict of interest, and unclear whether it's happening in this industry, but if money is flowing from a business to an accreditation agency has some kind of vested interest to make sure that the corporation sticks around to make sure they can keep getting money back from them, right? Yeah. So the concept of capture is one that exists in a bunch of places. You have this accreditation organization, regulatory capture in sort of agency places and stuff like that. I'm wondering if go ahead, John.
Yeah, there are two things I'd like to follow up on your question to Pamela. First of all, just to confirm, Pamela, you were in a private facility through the federal government.
Yes, this occurred at a GO facility located in Lovejoy, Georgia, that goes Robert Dayton, I think it's RADDF, so Robert A. Dayton Detention Facility.
And were you there the whole time, the 78 months?
No. So the facility is a holding facility that contracts with the U.S. Marshals. So the folks that they house there either have open cases where they're going back and forth to court, which was in my case. I wasn't allowed to a bond, so until I was convicted and sentenced, they were housing me there. Other folks are being held there because they have been convicted and sentenced and waiting to be designated to a federal facility.
So as you talk about the difficulty in getting data, one of the extraordinary things I think is that we've had this experiment with private for profit prisons for more than 40 years. And there's an incredible lack of reporting and knowledge about how the industry is doing, or good news stories about how this private experiment is so much better, supposedly, than what the government can do. Have you encountered any of that in your own experience in advocacy, Pamela?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sure. I mean, in your advocacy work, I mean, do you find it more difficult to learn things about what's happening inside the private facilities?
Oh, yeah. So, yes, because even with the barriers that present us with the state facilities, the county facilities, those barriers are more, I guess, harder to penetrate. There's a real lack of transparency with the private prisons, again, because all the county jails and the detention centers and the local places still have to adhere to some type of regulations per government. But because these are private prisons, they don't have those same regulations. So yeah, so it makes it more difficult to get any information. And because the population of folks changes so regularly, where they're moving them out, moving them in. Because one of the things that I do as a directly impacted organization, because I am directly impacted, we stay in communication with folks that are incarcerated on the inside. And that's our way of being able to keep up with what's going on the inside, since there's no transparency to allow us through any other channels. But the challenge in that is these folks are moved quite often. These are temporary places, and they shift them around to get like a census count that they use for funding and all that type of stuff. So that's even challenging when you're just even trying to get information from folks that are inside.
Gotcha. I wanted to ask you a question, Pamela. While you were incarcerated, was that a time where you started to form some of the endeavors that you were going to take up once you got out? And because I'll let you answer that question. And I just want to know, how did that impact your time? If so, if you did start to develop some of the things you were going to do once you were released.
So yeah, I definitely took note on, things that I saw when I was inside that I knew that weren't right. For example, also at this facility, the drinking water, the water that was coming out of the fountain was brown, and this was the only water available for folks to drink. So I actually did some organizing on the inside around, oh, and they gave us recycled underwear. If you can believe that, yes.
What?
So there were things, yes. So there were things that when I was on the inside that I organized to, to advocate against, such as those things. And so yeah, so I definitely took notes. Everything definitely started in there because you had to, just to maintain, the conditions that you were subject to living in by being in there.
Right, right. And I guess the follow up to that was, once and I only ask these questions because I remember toward the end of my NFL career, I knew that I was going to shift into helping create resources for the players once I left. And so it gave me that unique perspective that's often overlooked, as a person who's been boots on the ground, giving, that perspective. And so it changed the last couple of years of my career in a sense that I felt like I was serving a greater purpose. And so I was just, the final part of that question was, once you started to take that on as something that you were going to do, how did that impact the remaining time that you had?
To be honest, I spent most of my time angry, angry at the things that had happened to me, um, because throughout my entire pregnancy, I never received any medical care, for falling or anything else. Once I finally got somebody to respond to my medical requests, and like I said, I responded back and let them know that this was not normal with pregnancy based on, my education and my professional experience. They brought me to medical, and basically the medical director and the consulting physician for the facility basically told me that they brought me up as a professional courtesy, which meant to me if I was anyone else, they wouldn't even be paying me any attention. And they wanted to let me know, because they were both women of color, that they could do nothing for me. And the way that they said it was, this facility was built for men. We didn't expect to have women. We definitely didn't expect to have a pregnant woman. And there is nothing that we can do for you. So I began to ask questions like, okay, so you don't have a handheld Doppler, or you don't have a contract with any OBGYNs? And they were like, we cannot do anything for you. We cannot even give you a prenatal vitamin. So what they proposed to do was send a request to the U.S. Marshals, whom they contracted with, to take me out to the ER to be seen. They sent the request, we got approval back, but the turnaround time for that was 4 weeks. So now we're talking about more than 7 weeks later, and they take me out to the ER. Again, I'm shackled. I'm sitting in the waiting area. So more humiliation, because when you're in public and you don't have knowledge of the criminal legal system and the way things work, and you see them bring someone in with all these chains and shackles, your first thought is that this person must be a murderer, did some type of horrific thing for them to have her chained down that way. And just watching people's response to me, moving away, grabbing their kids, it was very hurtful and very, humiliating. And then well, which I already knew from my medical background, but when we spoke to the ER doctor, I already knew they weren't going to see me. He was like, oh, this is more than 6 weeks old, not an emergency. We can't help her here. She needs to see an obstetrician, better yet, a perinatologist, because the fall has now made this pregnancy high risk. And he said I could call someone and we can schedule something, you can take her. And they were like, no, we only got approved to come here. We have to take her back to the facility. They did another request. It was another 4 weeks. And they took me out to see an obstetrician. The first thing she said was, before I was even able to get undressed or anything, I need a stat ultrasound to know the status of her baby. Of course, she didn't have that equipment in her office. Her office was located on the grounds of the hospital. She asked them, can we just walk across the parking lot to the hospital? I can perform the ultrasound? No. We're only approved to come to this office. They took me back. We did another request for an ultrasound. They brought me back to the hospital, but not to the doctor's office. So at the hospital, the ultrasound was completed by a radiology technician who is not authorized to read the ultrasound. So I got the ultrasound, but I still didn't know the results. So another request, another approval, another 4 weeks, and it was in those last 4 weeks that I miscarried. So, and then even miscarrying, at 10 o'clock at night, they lock you in your cell. There are no emergency call buttons, nothing you can do. So if there is any type of emergency, you have to wait until a guard comes around and does rounds and checks your cell before you can get any help. That particular day, like I said, I had organized around brown water coming out of the fountain. The warden had agreed that we should get ice and fresh water into the pod every day. Well, that was at the discretion of the officer, because if they didn't want to do it, they would just tell us that ice machine's not working today. So this particular day, I hadn't drank anything all day. And as soon as we were locked down, I started having cramping, which I knew were from me being dehydrated. And those cramps ended up turning into contractions. And then I felt the gush between my legs, and because it's completely dark except for a small slot at the top of the cell that shines over your head, I had no idea what was coming out of me. I just used my instincts, laid down, and just, clamped my legs together until somebody came. I had the women that were the woman that was in the room with me beating on the door to the other women to say that there was something wrong with me, something wrong with my baby. I could hear the women banging and yelling, trying to get any kind of attention for someone to come. It was over 2 a.m. in the morning before anybody ever came and made rounds to check on us. And when they opened the cell door, the gush that I felt between my legs was blood. It was all over the cell because I was hemorrhaging. And even at that point, there was debate about what to do with me. The officers felt like they should call the marshals. The medical staff was like, we should call 911. And they debated about this until I just was like, somebody please, I had to plead with them to please call 911, because at this point, not only am I afraid for my baby's life, but my life as well.
There's a lot of things that stand out about that story. I can't help but think about it. There's just a order released in a case in Arizona about healthcare in prison facilities and how they're not in throughout the Arizona prison system, even in public facilities, because the care is privatized, right? They contract with a private vendor to provide the healthcare. They're not meeting constitutionally required standards of medical care, right? And the case has been going on. I was just looking at the order. There's like 3,400 docket entries in that case. The parties' names have changed. The judges have changed. It's been this like case study in how crazy this kind of civil litigation can get. But one thing that that this feeds into is like, because there's a profit motive, the reasoning to provide care to somebody, that they're going to provide as little as possible, right? Like I remember when my partner was pregnant, we were tethered to an OBGYN. I mean, you're making visits all the time. They're checking all the time. They're like, they say if anything happens, here's these numbers, right? Like, you need to call me immediately if you recognize any of these symptoms. Like, you feel like you're becoming friends with these people, like the nurses and everybody in that facility, because you're there so often. Like, you know about them, you know their first names, like, you know what their families are like. To go for so long. And I wonder, in your perspective, if you think that your medical background changed your perspective on that. Like, I wonder if people would have expected more or less care. The fact that you knew how much care you should have been getting changed the way that you thought about it. I wonder if your background had any impact on how it felt to you.
My background had a big influence on everything that went on with me because of my medical education and my professional experience and being specializing in women's health. I've done OBGYN, I've done labor and delivery, gynecological oncology, the whole gamut, which is what makes me be a specialist in women's health. So I know what the proper protocol and procedures were for everything that was going on with me. So I was very aware of what was all wrong, and and that nothing was right. And these women knew that, which is why, like they said, they brought me up front as a professional courtesy, because they understood that I knew. And for me, this is how I was able to speak to the things that went on with me inside. Like I said, if I didn't have my experience, I probably would never have even gotten a conversation with these women. They probably would have just left me back there and not even tried to do anything. And that's what really made me angry, because most women don't that are in there don't have a medical background. They aren't aware. And we should not, you should not have, I should not have had to have, the background that I had to get care. Proper care is due to all, at the end of the day. And so yeah, so all of these things, and they even put a note on my chart. So like even everywhere that I went after that, at every federal facility, they knew what my background was. So they were always questioning me, asking me, "Are you okay with this? Are you okay with that?" But my response was always to them, I would like for you to, the same questioning and care that you're taking with me, if you would do it with any other woman that comes through this door. Not because you're concerned about liability, but because this is your job and we take an ethical oath to uphold the care of folks, regardless of what setting they're in.
One of the things that I feel so lucky about having done a few episodes of this podcast is talking to people and highlighting the sort of courageous actions that they've taken. And in talking to them, I think sometimes people don't recognize like the courage that it takes to do what they did. But I think it's a really special ability to be inside of a facility and start organizing and agitating, because that like makes you a target, right? And then to go out, like once you're back in public, to continue that organization and being like, this needs to change. There's like moral problems with the way that people are being treated. I wonder if you have any thoughts about like what causes you to be the kind of person to take that stand, right? And say like, yes, treat me better because of all of these reasons. Like, be better to me, but don't stop with me. Be better to everybody.
Well, I'm just thankful that I have always been very outspoken. Even as a kid, it was probably a pain to most people, but it was helpful to me, in this situation. And the problem with most folks that are incarcerated is, one, they don't know, they're not educated enough to know. So therefore, a lot of the injustices that they incur, they think that they have to, because we buy into the myths of, if you are incarcerated, you deserve whatever happens to you. And that's not true. They don't deserve it. No one does. At the end of the day, regardless of whatever mistake that you have made that has you incarcerated, you are still a human being. Those women are still mothers, sisters, wives, and they deserve better. And I'm getting emotional now, because I get emotional when I hear them think. They buy into it. They do believe that however they're mistreated, that it's okay because they did something wrong and they deserve it. And that's a lie. And trust me, I spent many a day when I was there asking why am I here? Why did this happen to me? I don't question that now. Now I say I'm thankful that it happened to me, because had it not happened to me, I would still be out here believing those same myths, buying into the same stuff that these women did. But because I was there, I'm thankful that I was able to make them understand that those are lies and they don't have to believe those lies and they don't have to accept that. And I was able to show them, this is what you do when you're not being treated properly. These are the rules, these are the laws, because I was educated enough to know these things. So I was able to pass them on to them. And even coming home and being told repeatedly, there's nothing you could do. The statute of limitations have expired. We have organizations that have worked on shackling for more than 10 years and never been able to get a committee hearing. I could have easily been like, okay, fine, let me leave it alone and, find something else to do. But again, being outspoken and being stubborn and just refusing to hear the word no, I kept pushing forward like there's something that I can do. And I'm thankful that I did. And so now, instead of asking why, I say there's not a why. Why is because I was the person to do it. And so now I feel like that is my duty and my obligation to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to another woman. So the life of my child that I lost is not in vain. It's a stapler to save the lives of other babies.
I remember like pretty clearly when I realized that there was this deep, deep undercurrent of retribution related to the criminal justice system. And you were talking about how you were stubborn as a kid. I must have been so annoying as a high school student. Um, but so everybody who put up with me back then, thank you. But one of the things I remember very clearly is in, senior government class or whatever, there was this project. You take an issue and debate it or whatever, right? That's the same project that everybody does. And I picked the death penalty, and I started doing all this research on the death penalty, all the statistics, everything about the death penalty, how it costs so much more money. We're executing innocent people regularly, all of these things, right? And put together what I'm sure was a terrible PowerPoint presentation, but it felt great at the time. And we polled people before and after the presentation to see if you change anybody's mind. I didn't change anybody's mind, right? And so I started asking people, like, are you not convinced by the facts? Like, do you not believe the facts? What's going on here? And the people who were still for the death penalty after having had this like conversation were, to a person, people that use that desert language that you just talked about, right? Like, you're in the criminal justice system because you deserve it. And I think that that's like it's something that doesn't get a lot of discussion, but there's this thing in the American psyche that just thinks that people deserve to be punished. And
Right.
that allows them to like dehumanize everything, right? And like one of the things that Abolish Private Prisons has struggled with is just getting people to care about people that are in private facilities. And like we get we get feedback from people that's like, well, they could be in a public facility. So like, what's the problem, right? Or just a lack of humanity in how they deal with people.
There are many ways to get involved with the Prison Cells podcast, build your moral courage, and help us eradicate for-profit prisons in the U.S. Visit abolishprivateprisons.org today and build the momentum of abolishing private prisons by working with an organization to pass a resolution in support of the cause. Get to know the ins and outs of how private prisons operate and why. Outside of the site, you can write your congressperson and shed light on this awful practice. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to the Prison Cells podcast from wherever you listen. Now back to the discussion.
Yeah, trying to get white folks to care is tough, Rob. It's tougher than because and I hate to take it there, but I mean that's what's embedded in the fabric of this country and how we've kind of traveled from A to the destination that we are now. And Pamela, I can just I feel you so much when you became emotional, because I know the impact of the fear that they have when a person's educated. When a person is educated, there is a certain fear that the institution feels, because that one person can affect so many minds, and they can they can change the hearts of so many people to create an uprising, i.e. our civil rights leaders and those things. And that was the fear of those people. And when I was incarcerated, I don't know how many letters that I had guys who were getting sentenced to prison time, and they were going to write the judge, and just because of their lack of education, they were saying shit to the judges that you can't say to judges.
Exactly.
And I was like, hey dog, no, let's say it like this, and I think it'll be received a little bit better. And to a man, those guys were like, man, thank you for helping me correct that and not embarrassing myself in front of this judge, but ultimately being looked at as a human.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you can't have an honest conversation about prisons and about criminal justice without slavery, right? And like the
Right.
roots
Exactly.
of the whole police system as being part of the, maintaining of the slavery institution and all of that stuff. So getting white people to care about the issue is very, it in APP terms when we talk about it, the way that one of the claims that APP has about private prisons is it's the latest incarnation of slavery, right?
But the
And
but the most disheartening part about that, Robbie, is that the people who are actually enacting these injustices look just like us, and that's the hardest part. It's like they become a part of the institution, and so then you're fighting against your own kind who are institutionalized mentally by the bigger concept, and it just becomes a jaded process because it's like you're speaking to the mentality of it, but it's coming from people who look like us, and that's where it just becomes so frustrating on the parts of the people who care.
it's this embedded power structures, right? Like
Yeah,
everybody's like scraping for every little bit of power they can. Right? And so if you can
exactly.
become a part of the power
Oh,
structure, then you're going to resist change to it.
you said that, Robbie.
So I guess this is a decent transition point to go from while we're talking about power structures. What are you up to now? Who's your organization? What's your goals? What are some of the very positive changes that you already have been able to implement?
So, from that meeting with Senator Booker and learning about the federal legislation, Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act, I was able to partner with Van Jones and Jessica Jackson, who were the founders of an organization called Cut 50 at the time, and made a decision that if we could not get it passed on the federal level, then we would do the work in the states. And so, partnering with them, we were able to pass dignity legislation in about 15 states. And then I took up this work on, solo with RestoreHER. And at this point, we have passed that same legislation, dignity legislation, which, so there are different dignity bills. So with Cut 50, they had their own language. My language and my dignity bills are based off my personal experience. So they include shackling and solitary confinement. And so as of now, we have a total of 21 dignity bills that have passed across the country. As I stated earlier, with Alabama being the latest. And gosh, they were a tough cookie to crack, which, like we were just talking about slavery, they could not comprehend not having women shackled, i.e., Montgomery, Alabama, where we had the most slaves shackled there. So it was very challenging. They were the most challenging out of all of the places that I have advocated for the passing of this legislation. Another big issue around passing legislation is like victory, no victory, because implementation is a major problem. And that is because, as we were talking about earlier, the lack of data. So finding these women to make sure that, they're not being shackled, they're not placed in solitary is exhaustion. So it's a big part of the work. So we created new legislation to solve that issue. And to be honest with you, I was not really mad that they weren't implementing the dignity bills because I prefer this new legislation. It's called the Women's Care Act. CARE is an acronym for Childbirth Alternatives, Resources, and Education. And the way that the Women's Care Act is designed is if a woman is pregnant and incarcerated and convicted and sentenced to serve time in prison, her sentence is deferred until 12 weeks postpartum. So this will allow her the autonomy to make her own decisions about her prenatal care, about what happens to her baby, allow her some time to bond with her baby. Here in Georgia, women are given a max of like 2 hours. It's supposedly per shift to spend with their babies, but again, that's at the discretion of the officer. So they may get 2 hours, they may get no time at all, except for the time that they see them after birth. So imagine, giving birth to a baby, and before you can count the fingers and toes, that baby's taken from you and you don't see it again. Because after that, these women have 24 hours to say where their baby is going to go. And if they don't have a plan in place, then that baby becomes custody of the state. And then you have the psychological and emotional pain of doing your time, not knowing where your baby is, if your baby's being cared for, mistreated, or what is happening with your baby. Then you get out, you have to find your baby, and then you have to fight to get your baby back. That should not be. And as I always say, the price that we pay highly exceeds the crime and far exceeds the sentence. We are not sentenced to lose. I wasn't sentenced to the death of my child. These women are not sentenced to lose their babies to a system. These women are not sentenced to have to deal with the mental anguish and losing parental rights. These women are not sentenced to have to come home and fight to get their children back. That's not the sentence. But these are the things that come along with these sentences that people do not think about on a daily basis. So what this bill will do will allow them ample time to make arrangements for their baby, not a 24-hour type thing. Allow them to be able to breastfeed their babies, have some type of bonding with their babies. And so we introduced it last session here in Georgia. It passed all committees unanimously, as well as the House floor. But unfortunately, we ran out of time for the final Senate vote on Sunny Die. And with that, in this bill, we also have data collection. Now, the sheriffs liked the bill because, as they told me, Sheriff Norris, that they didn't want pregnant women in the facility. They don't want to be bothered with them. They don't want to be held accountable for them. However, he still fought me about data collection. He did not want the data collection in the bill. I fought him back about it. And I always wonder if maybe that's why we ran out of time on Sunny Die before we got that final vote. Because I was able to convince these senators that we needed some type of data collection in that bill, and they agreed with me. The sheriffs weren't happy about it and asked if the data could be housed with the Sheriff's Association. And we all know what that meant. If they are housing it, we still not going to get it. And so it was a lot of things that came in play at the last minute around the data collection. But we're not giving up. We're going to come back this year with the Women's Care Act. We're also going to introduce it in other states. We've been talking to folks in Alabama about bringing it there, looking at Florida, looking at Kentucky, and we're going to also be doing some work in Alaska this session.
Real quick, what is Sunny Die?
Sunny died. That's the last day of session. That's what they call it. That's how they term it. It means it is done.
Got it.
So
Yeah. I worked in the Arizona legislature for a little bit, and I remember there's this flurry of activity that happens, and like everybody's trying to cram through things. I know John worked at the legislature too. I'm sure those, 48 or 72 hours right before the session ends are a manic place.
Yes.
Well, and Sine Die, at least I know that they've got some use of my 4 years of Latin from my previous high school education. Yeah. Could I ask you to talk a little bit more, Pamela, about the organizations you founded? So one of them is RestoreHER.org, I
Yes.
believe.
RestoreHER.us.
Okay. And Robbie asked you before, what are your ultimate goals with this? I noticed that one of them was that no children would be born in prisons.
Prison. Yes. So the ultimate goal of Restore Her is that we end mass incarceration of women of color and end prison birth for women.
Well, that also sort of ties into this week's current events.
Yes.
So the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, and the pro-life movement has reason to celebrate. Has there ever been any effort to look at the issue of the impact of incarceration on an unborn child? So there is an incredible amount of post-traumatic stress syndrome for people who are incarcerated and for people who work in prisons.
Right.
Has there been any study done of the impact on the health of unborn children from having pregnant women incarcerated?
Yes, there have been studies which show a lot of different psychological effects on those kids. Also, with the reversal of Roe versus Wade, that's going to bring major implications for incarcerated pregnant women. Some of the women that I have talked to have already expressed concern about if, like myself, if they miscarry in prison, knowing that the facilities don't want to be held liable or accountable for what happened to make them miscarry. They're afraid of the blame being placed on them and then being sentenced to more time because they miscarried their baby. We also have the elephant in the room that no one ever discusses or wants to talk about, the women that get impregnated while they're incarcerated by the guards. So in these cases, most times these women are given abortions because we don't want, all the drama and all of the things that come along, the liabilities that come along with that. So what's going to happen now, if these women get pregnant? Are they going to be given a pass to get an abortion, whereas others are not? Currently with incarcerated women, based on, obtaining an abortion is per se based on the facility you're located in. Even with private prisons, like I told you, everybody does their own thing. They have their own rules, their own protocol. So in some facilities, you can have access to an abortion, but you have to pay for it. You have to pay for the procedure. You have to pay for the officers that have to transport you and stay there with you. So it's very expensive. In other places, you're not given an option at all already prior to the reversal because they don't want to deal with all of the, red tape and everything that it takes to get you there and get it done. So Georgia is one of the states that has the highest maternal infant mortality rates. And I'm expecting those rates to definitely increase now that with this reversal. But we're just concerned about incarcerated women being criminalized under this reversal.
And to follow up on a little bit on that, John, I know I just was reading that the American Academy of Pediatricians, the AAP, just increased the recommendation for breastfeeding for 2 years instead of 1 year because, consistently data is coming out that shows that is so important to a baby's development in so many different ways, physically, emotionally, the respiratory system, the immune system, all that stuff. So,
That's
since
got
that is not
nothing to
available,
do
so-
with the formula shortage.
I'm not sure that maybe
I'm bullshitting. I'm
Yeah.
bullshitting.
Look, I'm willing to call a lot of people into power when there's a financial
Well,
incentive
actually,
there, but
it does because if these babies are not with their mothers, they're not able to breastfeed them. So they definitely have to have formula.
Right.
exactly.
It all works. It all ties in.
Right.
Yeah. So one of the things that is there ways that people can help you? I mean, I think state legislators oftentimes are responsive to their constituents in a way that federal legislators aren't.
Absolutely.
Is there, through RestoreHER or any other way, is there, if I'm listening and I want to, these bills are obviously important, how can I get involved to help?
So the petition that I told you that I started that led me into this space is on change.org, and it's passed the Dignity for Incarcerated Women's Act. We are trying to get beyond the threshold of 200,000 signatures. So that would be a help if people could go on the petition and sign the petition. Also, follow us on our social media. It's at RestoreHER US.America on Instagram and Facebook. We put what we're currently working on, any call to actions that we have, we put those things there. In your states, you can contact your legislators, senators, all of the above, to let them know that you want the Women's Care Act. You are in support of that. When it comes to your state, you want it passed because it's important to you. So you can help in that way as well. Of course, donations are definitely accepted, monetary and in-kind donations, because the women need everything when they're coming home. Here in Georgia, we don't have a state halfway house. Our federal halfway house has about 200 beds for men and only about 13 for women. So housing is a big deal. We are currently working on getting funding for an affordable housing project that we're working on with Shipping Living Homes. So we can provide housing for women who are returning home. We also have, we have a number of programs. We have Her Health, which is a health equity program where we're teaching women how to grow their own food, and beekeeping, where they can sell their food and honey to local places in the obtain farming license, which we have, to sell the food. We're teaching women those type things. And of course, we have, because of the lack of data, built out our own research program where we have just obtained our IRB certification. We have our inaugural research conference coming up in Savannah, Georgia on September 30th, October 1st, which you can get more information on our website at RestoreHER.us. And so donations for all of the programs and all of the work we're doing would definitely be helpful.
And we'll put links to all that different stuff in the description, because I think, there's a lot of different ways that people can help. So
Yes.
we can make it easy for people to do that.
Thank you.
In any way possible. Is there anything else you want to say? Anybody else have? I mean, I learned so much already.
No, I just want to say thank you. Just thank you so much for, your time, your vulnerability, and sharing with us. It's very impactful, and I believe, like me, it'll be helpful to those who listen.
Thank you.
Same here, Pamela, and I believe our connection initially was through End Mass Incarceration, the effort through Ebenezer Baptist Church and the
Yes.
temple in Georgia.
Yes,
So,
Rabbi Lydia, Senator Warnock, yes, great allies.
And
thanks for spending this time with us.
Yeah,
And
thank
I
you so much.
appreciate you all giving me the opportunity to educate folks and share the voices of those women that are inside that definitely need everyone's assistance.
Definitely. And to that end, as usual, I'm going to ask everybody to rate and leave a review. It's annoying, but it really does help. We've seen the numbers of people who are listening consistently rise, and it really does help give voice to the people that don't have it yet, the more people that hear these stories. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and thanks, everybody, for joining, and we'll talk to you guys next time.